Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 13 of Series 8. The question for today is free will a function of consciousness and identity rather than causality? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 4, Section 4. So my underlying question is, what can we do with our lives or with human existence as consciousness? And I'm posing questions about consciousness and proposing answers in terms of value. So to elucidate those questions and answers, we have been discussing the character of consciousness. Further to that objective, we are discussing the relation of the idea of free will to consciousness. That is, I believe that the idea of free will can help us to understand consciousness, and that the concept of consciousness can throw light on the problem of free will. We should begin by saying that the idea of free will has been a long-standing and difficult problem. John Searle, for example, described the lack of progress concerning free will as a scandal in philosophy. I hope to make some progress in this issue by employing the concept of consciousness. Yet we can first note that free will correlates with reflective consciousness, and that reflective consciousness is a precondition of free will. Animals, for example, don't have free will. But I want to begin by making several qualifications about the idea of free will. Firstly, the idea of free will is ancient, with presuppositions like the ideas of God, ethics, and the meaning of life. For example, free will might presuppose a binary account, or particular conceptions of freedom or of the will. We will look more closely at such presuppositions shortly. Secondly, interest in free will often derives from its function as a reason to find self-value or self-esteem. For example, Robert Nozick says that the absence of free will undercuts meaning in life. But I think that free will isn't an adequate means of finding self-value, self-esteem, or meaning. I argue for other ways of finding self-value or self-esteem elsewhere. Thirdly, and similarly, interest in free will often derives from its ethical function of attributing blame or merit. And we can legitimately ask how there can be any moral action without presupposing free will. But in my view, moral blame or praise is not an adequate way of describing human action. And fourthly, my main concern is to use the idea of free will to show the significance of consciousness. That is, although I will argue for a compatibilism, for a compatibilist version of free will, I'm not primarily interested in the question of free will itself. And I think that the notion of free will should be replaced with the idea of self-will. But the basic problem of free will is that we have two powerful yet contradictory insights. Firstly, that we feel ourselves able to act, at least sometimes, freely. And secondly, the principle of universal causation, that every event has a sufficient cause, is indispensable. But the view that universal causation prevents something like free will is simplistic, because it ignores different forms of causality, like complex causal fields and quantum mechanics. It overlooks the possibility of replacing causality with reasons for action. And it also ignores the graduation of mind and the function of consciousness. But Simon Blackburn poses a challenge to this view that determinism may not always be applicable. He asks us to explain how two situations can demand different ethical responses without referring to a difference in the situations themselves. My response is that identical situations have to account for the identity of the agents, which can't be identical. Also, different degrees of awareness will produce different responses in otherwise identical situations. And talking about identical situations in that way neglects consciousness and personal identity. Blackburn could answer that identity and consciousness have no bearing on the material outcome of such action. But the response that I want to argue below is that consciousness and personal identity are crucial in an argument for free will. My position is compatibilist as a form of free will that is compatible with reasons for action. I want to present 3 or 4 arguments in support of this view. I say 3 or 4 because the arguments are related. These arguments are as follows. 1. An argument from a phenomenology of consciousness. 2. An argument from the graduation of consciousness and correlation between reflective consciousness and free will. 3. An argument from self-identification with certain mental and neurological events. And 4. An argument about the complexity of those neurological events. The first phenomenological or existential argument is about our experience of free will. The usual existentialist argument is that we experience free will in our responsibility and anxiety. But another argument is that it's psychologically impossible to believe that our actions are determined. That is, because this belief would be such an impediment as to prevent us from acting at all. But more than that, even if our actions are determined, we still have choices. Determinism doesn't prevent choice, it claims to prevent what are called free choice. But believing or acting as if we don't have free will negates the choices that we do have. Whatever the origins of choices, the idea that we are not choosing to do this or that is false. So determinism cannot mean that we act like robots as though our choices have no significance. Choices and believing we have choices have consequences. Not accepting this is a travesty of the issue. We struggle to make choices, and that struggle affects the consequences of our choices. Given this belief, metaphysical issues about free will become less relevant to the meaning of our choice. This is so because we cannot avoid believing that we are responsible for at least some of our actions. And this belief accounts for an existentialist-like concern over morals, meaning and purpose. So what is relevant to our existential lives is the phenomenal fact that we appear and seem to have free will. Therefore, the crucial question about free will can be seen as phenomenological, not metaphysical. Yet there's another consequence of the psychological impossibility in believing that our actions are determined. That is, this realization forces us to make sense of this experience. And we must ask, what is the situation of this agent, that is ourselves, in this syndrome? And the function of consciousness thereby comes to the fore, to be discussed shortly. But we must first review some basic arguments for determinism. The standard case against free will is made by both psychological determinism and physical determinism. Psychological determinism is significantly based on psychology rather than phenomenology, and psychology tends to understand the mind as the brain with closed inputs and outputs. We previously saw the difference between Dayton's phenomenological self and the psychological self, and I've briefly outlined such an argument for free will above. Yet psychological determinism presupposes physical determinism that we must look at. That is, every physical event has a cause, and there are no uncaused events, including events in human minds. Otherwise, the world would be chaotic, and scientific understanding would be impossible. As evidence of this view, Benjamin Libet found indications of neurological activity that preceded thought. Libet detected unconscious brain activity before any recognized intention to act. This was supposed to show that mind events were preceded by brain events. Sam Harris also asked us to imagine a neuroimaging device to detect the subtlest changes in brain function. This would indicate what we were going to do before we had awareness that we were going to do it. Their conclusion is that acts we previously considered free choices were driven by unseen prior events. But these demonstrations of supposedly neurological preconscious causes do not disprove free will. What they do prove is unconscious mental activity. But we cannot accept the presupposition of Cartesian transparency of mind and a rationalism that rejects unconscious mental activity as not my own, or representing my free decisions. For example, speech also appears mysteriously from the unconscious without impugning our freedom. That is, decisions can be products of unconscious thought as well as of previously digested conscious choices. And decisions can be products of pre-existing values that are pre-conscious and evade conscious awareness. My point is that pre-conscious mind or brain activity does not prove determinism. Moreover, the holistic character of thought might not be captured by particular neural events. This is expressed in such theories as Donald Davidson's anomalous monism and David Wiggins' notion of cognitive underdeterminism. Yet psychological and physical determinism presuppose a concept of causality that these views question. Singular causes, for example, are anachronistic and need to be replaced by complex causal fields. As a basic example, did Jack fall off the ladder because he was too fat, inattentive, or for some other reason? My point is that causes are much more obscure than supposed. An argument for this is David Hume's notion of causality as an opaque process of constant conjunctions. That is, Hume argued that physical causes aren't necessary relations but are determined by observation, and that many causes that we observe are assumed or even turn out to be mistaken. This shows that the concept of causation is much more obscure than we thought it was, and we thereby can't simply apply it to complex relations of mind and matter. And we could also note that there are random and uncaused events that exist in the quantum world. But causal anomalies or quantum events don't offer a special class of discrete events useful to free will. Free will requires a kind of cause that's both personal and independent from standard causal process. And at this juncture, we need to make an important distinction between physical causes and reasons for action. That is, free will isn't just a matter of physical causation, but involves mental and cognitive relations. For example, Aristotle differentiated voluntary from involuntary actions and reasons from causes. For example, 2 plus 2 doesn't cause 4, but 2 plus 2 produces or necessitates 4 as an outcome. The conclusion is that reasons for action are different from causes of actions, and that people act on reasons, not causes. But this distinction between reasons and causes does not yet provide an argument for free will. This is because actions are motivated by reasons that have to come from somewhere, and it is the origin of these reasons that again might be argued to ground the determination. And actions must be motivated by reasons, yet they can be unconscious or holistic and not just conceptual. If they are not, they either produce instinctive or insane acts which aren't the motivations of free will. So the question is then, how can reasons for action be regarded as producing free will? We need to step back for a moment and ask about the origins of reasons for action. And reasons for action should not always be defined in strictly rationalistic terms. But neither uncaused quantum events or holistic thought release us from a wider circle of explanation. Reasons for action of some kind are still required. Actions without reasons are incoherent, not free. But reasons can include a wider circle of meaning, perception, and human consciousness. That is, facts like personal identity and knowing that I exist can be reasons for action. Yet we need to explain how they can be reasons for action. To show this, we need to go back to the idea of graduation and degrees of consciousness. And we can see that animals, fetuses, and the comatose don't have free will. They can't deviate from instincts and impulses. But reflective human consciousness has a capacity for what we call free will. But complete free will is unrealistic. For example, Sartre wrote that we are wholly and forever free or not free at all. But some thinkers like Merleau-Ponty, Julien Baggini and myself believe in degrees of free will. And social science reveals diminishing degrees of choice in the reasons why we do things. So we must ask, to what extent can our choices be considered to be made freely? More broadly, it is uncontentious that reflective consciousness is a necessary condition of any free will. Moreover, if free will exists, it must exist in different degrees at different levels of consciousness. And different degrees of consciousness or of awareness change the quality of a reason for action. Moreover, the existence of reflective consciousness is itself a factor in reasons for action. And such variable factors argues for something like free will to explain it. Yet this is an argument about preconditions and not yet an argument for free will. This is my second argument based on consciousness and on degrees of consciousness, and this is as follows. Firstly, reflective consciousness is essential to the possibility of free will. Two, there are different levels or degrees of consciousness in animal to human development. Three, higher levels of consciousness produce greater degrees of what we call free will. Therefore, something exists at different levels that we call free will. But we need to define what this is and redefine free will. We should first look at Sartre's attempt to employ consciousness as a basis for free will. He holds that man is condemned to be free, that is, to make his own choices and be responsible for them. So conscious human beings cannot escape choice and we are therefore condemned to be free. Yet Sartre also holds that choice and consciousness are one and the same thing. That is, we cannot escape choice, and even not to choose is a kind of choice. But I'm not so sure. We might be indifferent or simply unaware of our choices. And we also saw that Sartre thinks that we are either wholly and forever free or not free at all. And we also saw that Merleau-Ponty, Baggini, social science and myself argue against a binary or an either-or view. And the graduation of mind and awareness argues for degrees of free will. So I don't believe that Sartre's account of consciousness and free will is acceptable. Yet I think that we need to look for something else about consciousness in addition to its graduation. We need to look for something that is uniquely our own, that makes our reasons for actions our own. This is because if our reasons for actions are our own, they are free from external constraint. And the crucial property of consciousness that is unique and personal is our personal identity. So I need to say something about the relation between personal identity and free will. My third argument for free will is thereby about our identification with our own thoughts and ideas. This identification with our own thoughts employs a crucial distinction between self and non-self. That is, if we can identify with our own thoughts and reasons for action, they are our own and we are free. But it is illusory to identify every thought as our own. We have a huge capacity for misidentifying motivation in such forms as bias and unconscious motives. For example, consciousness is constantly attending to its dispositions and can't be separated from them. This identification gives the false impression of ownership, choice and free will. But this is an error of misidentification that also provides an argument for free will. Identification with thoughts that precede choices cannot always be distinguished from one's own identity. We have some thoughts that we claim as our own thoughts unless they are intrusive thoughts. And the question of free will presupposes a distinction between my reasons for action and alien reasons. But identification with preceding thoughts enables a claim that my reasons are aspects of myself. Therefore, these reasons are my reasons, and I have free will when I act on them. The possibility of not acting on reasons that I don't identify with also provides a basis for belief in free will. For example, coerced actions or actions not based on authentic beliefs when not acting on internalized values. But there's a question about the deepest origins of our thoughts not being our own and thereby undermining free will. Yet the indiscernibility of these origins can be employed as an argument for free will. That is, it becomes increasingly impossible to differentiate acts of the will from certain neurological and other causes, because at different levels of mind there is increasing degrees of complexity in their causal fields. We can then correctly identify those complex incipient causes or reasons as our own. This is because they are indistinguishable from our own thoughts and reasons. And if we identify those causes as our own, then we are free when we act on them. I'm saying that the origin, the kind of motivation, and seeing them as my own are crucial in the question of free will, and that I can claim free will if motivation is derived from a source that I can regard as my own will. I cannot claim free will if motivation is derived from an external source that compels me to act. And this distinction is harder to maintain the deeper we look into the origins of motivation. At increasingly deeper levels, the distinction between my impulses and alien impulses becomes less viable, and the origin of motivation as either self or non-self becomes increasingly less significant. Internalized thought and identification with impulses become valid motivations in free choice. The identification of certain thoughts with ourselves thereby provides a realistic claim of free will. It offers a solution to the contradiction between causal determinism and free will. It also avoids the incoherence of a choice without a preceding mental event. This is a form of compatibilism or graduated compatibilism, yet it also should be described as self-will rather than free will. And the standard question used to determine free will of could I have acted otherwise becomes redundant. I could have acted differently, but according to another set of ideas. Yet the ideas would be subject to the judgment of whether they are mine or not. If the ideas are not mine, I won't act on them. If they are mine, I will act on them. Either way, I have free will. Thereby the question, could I have acted otherwise, given another set of ideas, is redundant. It is like asking the senseless question, what would I have done if I was a different person? But doesn't just accepting my motivations as my own simply give up the possibility of real free will? No, I don't think it does, for two reasons. One, we are still discriminating between what motivations we identify with and those we don't. Free will is acting according to my own interrelated beliefs and ideas. Two, yet the complex and graduated nature of our deepest motivations eventually nullifies that distinction. These are two valid ways of discriminating between motivations that support a form of free will. As noted elsewhere, the thoughts in our heads don't all have the same status or origin. Some of them are, for example, one, internalized thoughts or even unwelcome thoughts. Two, having a thought is not identical to wanting to carry it out. And three, there are differences between thoughts, intention, speech and action. One outcome is that this compatibilist form of free will can be described again as self-will. In the case where one, primary mental events are interpreted as my own reasons for action, and two, greater degrees of free will correlate with greater degrees of consciousness and choice. The view that we are totally determined is as incredible as the view that we are totally free. To clarify this process of ever increasing complexity and integration, we can describe it in two ways. One, reaching down from consciousness to the unconscious. Two, reaching up from indiscernible first causes to reflectively conscious acts of will. The motivational process reaches down into a regress of ever more subtle and complex forms of integration with thoughts and ideas. At incipient levels of conscious and nascent causality, distinctions of self and other are blurred. At this level, minuscule events can later have larger consequences that we can call free choice. The motivational process reaches up into higher levels of consciousness, promoting faculties of personal identity of what we call free will. And reflective consciousness vastly increases what can be brought to bear as reasons for action. For example, personal identity, reasoning processes, powers of abstraction and discrimination. Consciousness increases the scope of what I can affirm or deny as my own thoughts. But does personal identity have sufficient material content to provide reasons for action? Not at the level of pure self-consciousness. Yet pure self-consciousness seems to be a fiction. Consciousness needs content. In conclusion, we began this inquiry with the idea that it's psychologically impossible to believe that our actions are determined. This led to the consideration of consciousness and personal identity as key features in explaining free will. That is, consciousness and reflective consciousness correlate with the experience of free will. This isn't a conclusive argument for free will, but it gives us something that needs explaining. And that something is difficult to explain on a determinist account. I concluded with a compatibilist position that we are subject to both reasons for action and free will as self-will. I gave three arguments for this view. One, phenomenologically, the appearance and belief in free will is crucial to substantive free will. Two, reflective consciousness correlates with something that we can legitimately call free will. And three, our identification with our deepest reason for action produces free will as self-will. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.